Thank you for coming to today's edition of ASEF Unplugged. Okay, I would like to begin by asking one question from the audience. Is there anyone who does not know what ASEF is? Okay. Let me give a very brief introduction of what ASEF is and what ASEF Unplugged is all about. So the Asia-Europe Foundation is, and prepare for a mouthful, an intergovernmental not-for-profit organization based here in Singapore. We've been around for the past 22 years, since 1997. We are publicly funded by an informal political dialogue process called the Asia-Europe Meeting, or ASEM, which is comprised of over 50 countries in Asia and Europe, plus the European Union and the ASEAN Secretariat. Every year they give us annual financial contributions for us to be able to do our work. And our work, our job, our mandate is to, quite simply put, is to bring Asians and Europeans together. Arts and culture is one of ASEF's 7 priority areas, or what we call thematic areas. And we also work in the areas of education, governance, the economy, media, public health, and sustainable development. So it's quite a lot. We are not a cultural foundation as such, although people in our sector tend to think so. And ASEF Unplugged is an event series by ASEF's Culture Department. It's quite new, because in the past, over the past 22 years, we have been organizing big conferences and public forums, and we would do like 1 or 2 a year. And last year, we've decided to kind of kill that idea and do a smaller scale format of gatherings, where the aim is to facilitate peer-to-peer conversations amongst and between Asians and Europeans on topics of mutual interest in the arts, culture, and heritage, which is what we are doing now. So usually the audiences are smaller, and we aim for it to be more engaging and interactive. So there will be no PowerPoints, no presentations, no papers and lectures and so on, and we would invite you to participate in the discussion later on. And our topic for today is a bit of a delicate one could say a very tensioned one, because we are talking about cultural mobility or international travel, and the environment, environmental sustainability, because there is no doubt that we all need to travel and get outside of our comfort zones, and to see other people, and to meet other people, and to do things with people who are not from the same background as us. But in doing so, we are, hurting our planet. And also, we live in the times where countries and nations and people and culture are having tensions with each other. So how to reconcile all these things in our daily practice now. And so today we have our distinguished speakers. First we have Ferdinand Richard. I said that right, he's from France. Perfect. Welcome. Ferdinand is from Marseille, and he is the founder and managing director of AMI Association in Marseille, which is a cultural development platform and an incubator for cultural micro businesses. It was one of the first in France. For the past 10 years, he has also been the president of the Roberto Chimeta Fund, which facilitates international travel for artists and cultural professionals between Europe, the Middle East, the Arab region. Concurrently, he also sits on the panel of our travel grant, Mobility First, which does the same thing, but between Asia and Europe. And he's also a musician. Our second speaker is Melissa Lowe. Melissa is a research fellow at the Energy Studies Institute at the National University of Singapore. Her area of research is climate change, and in particular the Paris Agreement and the implications of the Paris Agreement and how the signatory countries are implementing or progressing on the climate pledges. And she has a Master of Laws in climate change law and policy from the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. And our third speaker needs no introduction. Titi. Pulsar. Tato is from Singapore, or TT, has more than 30 years experience working in the arts, both locally and internationally. He was the managing director of Theatre Works, and then he was also the director of Arts Network Asia, which also facilitated cultural exchanges in the region. Most recently, he has been he is a consultant to Singapore's National Arts Council for the development and implementation of the new Arts Resource Hub, which gives invaluable resources to freelance artists and cultural professionals for them to be able to continue their practice sustainably. And concurrently, he is also on the panel of our travel grant, Mobility First. That's why they're all here. And so, we begin the conversation with TT. It's not fair. TT. Throughout your career, you have been a champion, and you have brokered cultural exchanges between arts practitioners in the region, including within Asia and beyond, and in Europe. And we all travel because we want to see things in person and experience things in person and to meet people in person. But now we are in 2019, 30 years later, and have the most advanced technologies at hand. This is our second Unplug in Singapore. Like a few months ago, we had one, and our European speaker joined via video, and that worked with a lot of logistical challenges, but it worked. And so the question is, do you think that at this day and age, the value of meeting in person or face-to-face encounters, has that diminished? Or is it an even more urgent need? And if artists from different regions now collaborate digitally, because now you can have connections without even leaving your room or your studio, would you still consider that like proper art making? What are your thoughts?
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. To kind of respond to, I think for those of you who know me, I'm a huge fan of mobility, especially cultural mobility. And that in the years, at least the last 2 decades of my work, and especially with the beginning of the Arts Network Asia in 1999, I do feel very strongly about cultural mobility for various reasons, right? I mean, for the reason that, there is the immediate engagement with the other, and, you get inspiration in terms of, for your creativity, you don't have to reinvent new ideas or styles of practice because it's already been done before. There is very much a lot of capacity building, knowledge sharing, inspiration, creative inspiration, not just for artists, but for people who are managers, for producers, as well as art students, etc., etc. And I think that the need for cultural mobility, for me personally, has not lessened over the years, and I do think there is a greater urgency, and personally for me, it's because of 3 key reasons. I think the first is that there is a kind of increased, this whole things to do with economy. The economies of creative and artistic sectors, whereby, and what does that mean? It means that increasingly we're looking at, there is a scarcity of resources, there's going to be a scarcity of funding, public funding or private funding. And what this means, and that we are constantly pushed as we do work. Let's say when I started 30 years ago and right now, when we're doing it 30 years ago, this whole idea of the box office and the economies was important, but wasn't a priority, be it for a company, an organization, or an individual artist. But talking about it right now in 2019, I cannot apply the same feeling as way back in 1989. I do feel that there is such an urgent need that we have, as people practicing, doing the art that we are professionals in, there is a pressure to think about the economy and how do we diversify our income, yeah? And sometimes, or perhaps in most times, cultural mobility is in a way an escape route for us, especially in countries and cities like Singapore, where both market and audience are small. So where do we begin to think about our own sustainability if we hit a kind of a glass ceiling? Yeah? So I think being an artist, for art's sake, is very important, but we cannot run away from the reality is that there are many artists there who is right now wanting to make a living out of their artwork. Yeah, so we can't deny that. Secondly, I think what was important for me is that, as all of you are well aware, there is the sense of increased xenophobia. There is an increase in terms of nationalism, whereby our lenses are beginning to be restricted by choice. We are shutting down. We are trying not to engage too much with the other. So I feel that mobility as a whole, be it for an artist or a cultural worker or as an individual, it will often give us a different perspective. It will give us a different perspective and understanding about the other. And so hope through travel, maybe there'll be less of an insularity. And I think the third point, which is kind of related to the first, is that the work that is done by artists and the arts professional is really mainstreaming in terms of mobility is the norm, quite frankly. It was very interesting that I was looking at the informal survey that ASEF did for this particular Unplugged conversation, was that 2/3 of the room, maybe some of you have participated in the survey, 2/3 indicated, one, they do travel for their work, and 2/3 also indicate they have international collaborators. Of course, perhaps those of us who are here today, we have an interest in mobility, but actually I was quite surprised with the figure because I always thought that it was a smaller ratio, and the idea of trying to get our arts workers and our artists to become more internationalized has always been a very important part of my private or personal agenda. And if you ask me about face-to-face, of course, I'm a fan of face-to-face meetings. Of course, sometimes I try to avoid having face-to-face meetings for various reasons. And I'll just say that, well, technology has permitted me to be less face-to-face. But you can't not have a face-to-face when you are trying to establish relationships. And I think for any kind of collaboration or artistic partnerships, face-to-face is very, very crucial. In my experience, I have discovered that in most instances, if I do a Skype conversation as the first kind of meeting, it is very unlikely I'll get the project. But if I actually have a sit down in a face-to-face meeting, it is more likely I'll be more successful in getting a kind of a collaboration partnership going on. Primarily because a couple of things. One, your would-be partner is actually looking at you and seeing how you behave, and we cannot run away from the fact that the way we behave is actually our own personal branding, right? You gauge a person by what he says, what he does. Then there's this whole thing about the body language, right? You can't see it on Skype, you can't see it on a WhatsApp message or WhatsApp video call, not really. And I think that when you have this kind of face-to-face, it really allows you to understand the nuances. It gets you to, you understand the people, the person that you're trying to forge a relationship with. You get to know them better. And finally, I do feel that face-to-face meetings really is, there's a lot of clarity. Simply because you're there, you want to go and spend a good, effective 1 hour. So you just zoom in on and say, okay, we need to resolve this. We need to have a clarity in how do we go about doing this. And there's no kind of like misinterpretation, which, a lot of times when you write emails, there's a lot of miscommunication. And especially in the work that I do, I'm working with people, collaborating with people whose first language or work is not English, not necessarily English. So you need to figure out this kind of like terrain. And as for art making, I can't imagine that, I really cannot imagine how you're going to choreograph a dance through video. I mean, you could as a kind of depending on the kind of artwork, but I think that you're not able to be in the same room to bounce off each other's ideas or to bounce off each other's text or speech and all that. Yeah. So I'm for face-to-face and cultural mobility.
Nothing replaces.
Nothing replaces. Yes, and of course, I suppose we will talk a little bit more about this whole conflict between wanting cultural mobility and what travel or mobility is contributing to climate change. We'll talk a bit more about that. Yeah.
Thanks, Nitin.
Okay.
Ferdinand. Hi. Since the 1980s, where's my script? You've been promoting multi-sectoral cooperation, through your work, through your incubator, and you have molded a lot of young cultural professionals, and at the same time, of course, also promoting cultural exchanges between Europe and the Arab world and the Middle East. So from your experience, what is the most important factor in people's creative process? And what makes them develop new ideas? What makes creative people stay creative? Like, can they do it alone? And in this digital age where we are all connected, not just connected, but hyper-connected, how has this so-called connection or more connectedness affected the creative process?
Good evening, everybody. Pardon me for my bad English. Probably, I'm coming from the south of France, where English is considered weird, if not dangerous. There is something to be said about art production. Art production is not like any other production. Artists are dealing with something which is at the core of their work, which is the invisible. This is not religion. It's about everybody, including the non-artistic people. We all have some invisible part of us, which is very difficult to get out. And I believe that the artist or the artwork is the medium between this invisible part of ourselves and the rest of the world. And art cannot progress without touching this invisible feeling. It's about feeling. So I fully agree with TT. You need to be in an immersion inside the society to understand where you are, who you are confronting. Images and written things and sounds are not enough. So you have to be in the middle of the story and feel this invisible thing. Because as an artist, you are supposed to restitute it through your own personal signature and form. But this is your work. You are the medium. You are the medium. There is an anecdote about that. I'll try to be short. It's something I like very much. It was written by a French essayist. We don't know nothing about the invention of music. There is no record on how music come to on Earth. And this guy said, I have the fantasy to explain you my idea of how music came. It was a very long time ago when people had the very first human beings. They had a very basic rude language. They couldn't really speak. They had some noises. And one of a couple died suddenly. And the other one tried to bring him back to life. And he was so emotional that his noises, rude noises, begin to change because of the emotion. And he began to modulate his voice, and then music was born. On the purpose to keep on discussing with the invisible. So the art forms are there for that. This you cannot put on internet. I'm sorry, you cannot put on internet. And to come back to the question of hyperconnectivity, oh, okay, I'm an old guy, but I am a bit suspicious about the fact that we are more hyper-connected than before. I think at some level we are more hyper-connected, but in some other levels, if you go on MRT, you look all these young people in the subway, they are not connected with the rest of the crowd, only through their smartphone. And then when it comes to something that is affecting most of the population in the world, which is violence, rude and direct violence, your smartphone is useless. When you are tortured, when you are raped, when you are beaten, you confront the reality and you are not connected, and your hyperconnection is totally useless. So you have then to find the means by yourself, because you are rudely immersed, embedded in the situation, and you have to find the resources to face it. So for me, this is, in order to kind of renew your message as an artist, you have to put yourself in the condition to confront yourself with emulation, with unexpected events, unexpected ideas that sometimes push you in a corner where you didn't plan to go, but this is where you are going to renew your stuff. And again, sometimes you cannot explain it, and it's a good thing. It's just something you have to feel.
And when you say that creative people need to confront others and new ideas and other people, you mean creative people confronting other creative people?
Yes and no, because I think this question of creativity is not a matter of professionals. It's a human right thing. Any human being, Article number 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says all human beings are equal in dignity and in right. For me, this means if you are equal in dignity, this means there is no dominant culture, which means that even the most humble of ours, somebody illiterate, a child, is in himself or herself a dwell of culture, and you have to protect that. So the right for any human being to be inventive, creative, is actually protected by this international declaration on human rights, but also by the Convention 2005 from UNESCO. I've been working for that for 6 years as an expert, and this has been ratified by all our governments, actually. So we are entitled to ask our governments if they respect the Convention 2005, and therefore if they authorize their citizens to have the means to be creative. I know it's a dream, right? But this is actually a right. It has been signed. So it's not only a matter of professional. So if you see the kids in my poor suburbs in Marseille, hanging around down in the blocks and looking, I don't want to know what they look on their smartphone, but doing nothing from all the day. There is something wrong in the education policy. There is a big loss of creative potential, and so we have to catch back on that to understand how we can make these non-professional artists become not only creative from themselves, but also telling us stories, explaining us their mediumness with their part of the invisible, because this will be fruitful for every one of us. And this is why we pay taxes, actually.
Thank you, Ferdinand. Melissa, hello. It has been a clear sentiment that cultural mobility, well, travel and exploration is an integral part of cultural professionals' lives. And so we'd like to ask you two connected questions. First, as the only so-called non-art person on the stage, could you respond to Titi and Ferdinand's thoughts on meeting in person and the need to travel? In particular, do you think that exploration is critical for the process of creation? And the second question is, well, we don't live in a bubble and we can say all of these things, and we have to travel and work with other people and create new things together, but in doing so, we are having a negative impact on the environment. And just for, I think, most of us here who don't know, can you tell us exactly how dirty is our journey? What do we do to the world when we travel? And we live in an age where many stakeholders are seriously questioning the methods of travel and even calling for reduced travel, particularly air travel. And so can you shed light on that?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you to ASEF for inviting me on this panel, and to all of you who are spending your precious Saturday evening with us. So I have about 10 minutes, right? I know this is a massive topic.
15 also can.
I know, yeah, it's a massive topic. And it's interesting, because you said as the only non-arts person, right? It's interesting because I do research for a living, right? And research is a little bit like art, right? You take things from different people, you do a literature review, and then you put it all together, and it's something like an art form. And it just so happens that my work is on climate change policy, climate change. And funny that you should mention air travel as well, because this year, the major climate change conference, does anybody know where it's happening this year? No, it's happening in Santiago, Chile. And I'm going to have to travel something like 27 hours to get to Chile just to participate in a massive conference of the parties who have signed up to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to talk about this issue. All right, and it's a huge amount of emissions for somebody who writes about climate change and tries to get people to do a little bit more. So it's a pleasure to be here to be able to talk through these issues with artists and with folks who are genuinely concerned about climate change. And I think this week has really been a week of awakening for many people, because you've heard in the news, we have our climate champion Greta Sumburg, the Swedish teen who is going around the world. She's sailing around the world, right? So she's putting a lot of shame on air travel. Apparently there's a new Swedish word, I don't know what it's called, but there's a new Swedish term for shaming air travel, yeah. And so you may have heard, she sailed from Plymouth in the UK, she sailed to New York City to participate in the UN Climate Action Summit. And so she really brought a lot of emotion. And this is difficult for a person living with Asperger's, okay, to bring that kind of emotion. You may have seen her video, it's gone viral now. She asked world leaders, how dare you, right? And how dare you steal my childhood, and I'm campaigning on climate change, something that you guys should be dealing with. So when it comes to air travel, I would say actually most of us, all of us, not just artists, are guilty of it. All right, it's something that is ubiquitous in our day and age. With the advent of budget travel, I think it's made regional trips a lot more affordable. I mean, you can go to, I think, anywhere in Southeast Asia for a couple $100. A lot of people are jet setters. they fly around as well. And I think same for artists, mobility is enabled by prices, right? By the cheaper prices. And this is, the International Aviation Transportation Association estimates that by 2035, if we don't start curbing our need for travel, we're gonna contribute, the aviation contribution is going to go through the roof. Right? I don't need to give you the numbers because it's Saturday afternoon, nobody wants to hear numbers, so I'm not going to give you numbers. But the idea is that aviation as a whole contributes to 2% of global emissions, okay, 2%. The problem with that 2% is that none of it is attributed to any country, okay? So the Paris Agreement, which was earlier mentioned as my area of research, only covers land-based emissions. So whatever is emitted in Singapore is counted towards our inventory, right? Once you leave the country on an airplane, it's not governed by anybody, okay? It's governed by the UN International Civil Aviation Organization, but nobody takes responsibility for that air travel. You can try and calculate your emissions, okay? So there are platforms. So the best way I use is the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, or ICAO for short. Earlier, one of my friends in the audience, Josie, she told me she's developed an app which will be available online in November, end of November, called Capture. And she told me about this website called shameplane.com, as in like literally shameplane.com, and it will tell you the amount of Arctic ice that, based on your travel, like you just key in your country that you're flying out of and key in the place that you're flying into, and it will tell you in terms of cubic meters how much ice you're removing from the face of the Earth. But if you just want the raw numbers, you go to ICAO, and you'll find out the numbers. The problem with that calculation is you're just calculating your share. There are 300 other people on that same plane flying to wherever you're going that probably has not even thought about it. Probably. All right? And it's worse if you travel business and first. Okay, so economy is probably best in this case because cattle class, right? Okay, so the point really is that I don't think we can avoid air travel. So I'm not here on this panel to say that you should not travel, right? Because people in research also do it. What I try to do is to offset. So basically it's buying trees, right? So you pay for a service for somebody else to reduce that emissions that you've put in the atmosphere because of your travel. If you have to fly anyway, at least put some money to it. And it doesn't have to be expensive. So what I try to do is I put my money towards regional projects. So I go on to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change website. I key in the amount of tons of CO2 that I've generated. Let's say it's 2 tons, and I buy 2 tons worth of offsets from a forest in Thailand. And it's like $16 US, for that trip. So it doesn't have to be really expensive. Some airlines even allow you to put it in your ticket, on the cost of your ticket. So it doesn't have to be inconvenient either. Now, what happens if you don't want to do all that? You want to call for a higher authority to do something. Okay, then I have a list for you. Okay, so obviously you can ask people like Boeing to make more efficient planes, to use less fuel, or to use biofuel. All right, so you could ask them not to use aviation jet fuel, which is a derivative of crude oil. Right? So you can choose to tell them not to do that, and demand that they use more efficient or more green type of fuel, which is biofuel. Interestingly enough, Singapore Airlines tried to do this a couple of years ago, where they flew its first flight to I think it was Seattle, purely on biofuel, but they imported that biofuel from Europe. Yeah, it was very strange because in Singapore, we produce biofuel from used cooking oil. It's just that it doesn't meet the standards at the moment, so European standards, where I think based on the plane that they were operating. So that's one way to require airlines to purchase or get more efficient planes. But once airlines buy planes, it's probably locked in for a certain amount of years, right? It's investment. The other thing, of course, is to invest in more research. into fuels that could be used, right? So not just biofuels. And the issue with biofuels, of course, is the food versus energy conundrum, right? So you have, why would you grow corn for biofuels when you could grow corn to feed people? Right, so this is a major issue with biofuels that people are still grappling with. Of course, you could also choose to fly direct as opposed to breaking up your flights. So route efficiency is very important. If you have to travel, at least make it as short as possible. So if you ask me, I'm going to Chile via the southern route. So I'm going down via Australia and then, so I'm not flying 2 stops to get, even though the airfare is a lot cheaper if I fly through Europe, but it's one of those things where you make choices based on the route so that you reduce the amount of emissions, if you bother to calculate. All right, so I think I'll leave it there. Hope I've answered more or less your questions, but the idea really is that you can take things into your own hands if you want to. Don't travel if you can help it. At least in my line of work, I can choose not to. But again, I hear the points that both TT and Ferdinand have made, and I think I've written it all down as well because I want to be able to process this information as well. And I think a lot of it also speaks to me as a researcher, right? You do have to meet people to be able to collaborate, and I really do appreciate those points being made. And I wonder where this debate is going to go, this discussion is going to go. But the reality is, I think a lot of us want more action to be done at the higher level. And some of the things I've said earlier about more efficient planes, greater efficiency in the routes. You've heard about DHL, what they did. They actually, in the States, I think they only asked for left turns. Like, they calculated their routes based on left turns only. So I know, because in the US, I think it's different left-hand drive, right? So you turn, instead of waiting at the light. So in Singapore, instead of turning right, you have to wait to turn right. So you turn left only, right? So it's quicker and you save a lot of fuel. And they've actually done the calculations that they've saved X amount of fuel because of that one change that they've made across all the jurisdictions that they work in. So if airlines could do that, I think we will all sleep a bit better at night that we have to travel. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, and then we can take some questions also from the floor.
Thanks, Melissa. An interesting point was brought up about the budget travel and how that has actually promoted more travel because it's now very cheap. We had an ASEF Unplugged edition in Amsterdam a few days ago, and it was, I think, some of you might have the reports, but that was a gathering. It was a closed-door meeting and a gathering of around 15 Dutch funders. And then the idea was that all the funders would come together to tackle how to incorporate the environment angle into all their cultural programs and grants. And out of the 15 funders, only one granting organization actually has an environmental incentive, and it was a huge failure. So there is the European Cultural, well, okay, not failure, but okay, wait. The European Cultural Foundation has a intra-Europe grant called STEP, and they have an incentive they give you a bigger amount of money if you choose to travel by land. So let's say they give you 1,000 euros if you travel by train or by car or by bus or by any other means, and you would get only, let's say, 500, 600 if you fly. The thing is, the successful artists who get selected in this grant would choose the lower amount for planes because you save more. Did I get it right? Yeah. Yes, yeah. Because you save more. So that's how it compares. So I would rather get less money because I'm just gonna get a Ryanair flight or something, and then I save more. So when they were talking about it, I was like, oh, okay, so it's not really working out our incentive idea, but they were the first kind of grant to create awareness about this, and we've just heard also from Melissa what ordinary people can do to kind of like offset their travel and so on. But again, we need like more higher powers to also help out. It's a multi-stakeholder kind of a thing. Which brings me to my next question for Ferdinand. What are your thoughts on this, on the environmental impact that mobility has? And as funders of mobility, do you think we have a role in this? And do you think that we have a say in kind of giving, not controlling, but giving advice on something that which we promote? Like, do we have an ethical or moral kind of responsibility? Is the responsibilities of the funders kind of evolving, or it's not our place?
Yeah. Well, you know, as usual, I never answer directly to the question. Sorry. As we have seen recently, nationalism is the worst. The idea that is driving the worst attack to environment, like in the case of Brazil, for example. And we know that today, these big questions, environment, but not only this one, like peace and violence, as I said before, cannot be solved by only one country. So for me, the key question behind the whole frame of this is the question of global governance, supranational governance, which we see also in Europe today. The difficulty with the European Union is that it has to deal with nationalistic ideas, and that it is very difficult to find an agreement between all these people to make a good decision. In the case of environment, it's obvious. The first answer of Bolsonaro when some leaders, including Macron, said Amazon forest is our concern because this is global, he said, oh, this is colonialism, because this is our country and no one is going to tell us what we can do with our country. So this question of global governance is the real key question for the coming generation. It will take time. I'll be dead by then, for sure. But we have to start it right now because it will take time. And the best way to create this kind of multicultural, global governance, supranational agreements is that people understand each other. So the fact that people, this is the paradox, the fact, and you clearly stated it, the fact that people have to travel to create the good conditions to go forward, and these days it's going a bit backward, but I hope that it will go back forward. These elements of good behavior that everybody would accept, including on environment, is moving the youth, is that the youth is going visiting each other. In Europe today, it's completely divided. The terrible thing is that we are dividing the society in two blocks. One block is the youth, educated youth that has been traveling, that is fighting against xenophobia, against all these very bad ideas. And why they do that? It's because they've been traveling. They've been meeting friends from other countries, from other culture. I have seen this morning a table in my coffee shop where you had this very interesting mix of young people coming from different parts of the world. And they were like very at ease with each other. We want to create this question of being at ease. You cannot achieve that only with internet. Bearing in mind that the other hyper-connected people today are the police and the secret services, and that we all know that what is going on internet might be fake. So there is also this question of, I want to go on the spot because I want to see with my eyes if what I saw on internet is real or not. There is also this effect. I want to touch the things with my hands. So at the beginning of all this discussion for me, is this question of renewing international institutions, having the young people taking their say, taking their part of the responsibility in this global governance transformation. It's not about only high politicians, it's really our stuff, and especially the young ones. And so you cannot just focus on one part of the problem and not touch the rest. Plus the fact that, of course, in Europe it's easy to take the train instead of the plane, but in developing countries it's in most cases very difficult because in most cases there is no train. And if you see the status of ground transportation in Africa, where I work very much, or in Arab countries, I am not so sure that it is less polluting than air transportation. All this is, you know, big Indian cities are dying of ground transportation pollution. So all this is very complex issue. But first of all, it is political, because environmental issues are of utmost political importance. This is led by political decision makers. We have to influence these guys, and we know that we cannot influence these guys without a very strong movement from the civil society. If we make a demonstration with 150 people, it makes no sense. We need to push these guys to understand that there is a global reorganization to be made on this subject and on other subjects, on which cultural diversity is very important. I used to say that you cannot treat, there are three main subjects, and I will stop after that: biodiversity, cultural diversity, political pluralism. You cannot touch one without touching the other. You cannot claim you will, find solution for one if you don't find solutions for the two others. It's an holistic approach. It's a political approach. In old Greek language, they used to say, millennials ago, they say culture, they say politic, they say in old Greek language politiki, and culture they say politikon. It's the same word. It's the same story. So there is a cultural approach to the question of environmental, obviously. And if you spoke to indigenous people, wherever they are, they will teach you this very quickly, very simply. And again, it has to see with the invisible, the spirit of the forest, the spirit of earth.
So the environmental issue, as you have said, is a political issue. It's a matter of governance. And then we need, basically a lot of stakeholders need to work together to kind of contribute to solve, to helping reduce the negative impact that we have on the environment. But what is our role as the funders of mobility? Do we have a role in that, or no?
Sure. We just bring people together to understand each other. So this is a very noble and very practical decision. To make it clear, it's not the fault of Mobility First. Of course, it's not the responsibility of Mobility First, ASEF, or any mobility fund to claim that they will transform or to stop people to traveling. That would be crazy. Now, making their benefiters aware of what our friend said before is extremely important. Making them aware that they can use this kind of CO2 contribution, footprint, etc., that there are websites existing, apps to use, etc., is a priority. But it cannot be put in the balance against the fact that people need to create political links between themselves without going through the big top-level deciders, political deciders. The interesting thing about internet is that, and I like it very much, including for the artists, it is that it created an instant, multilateral, uncontrolled space for people to talk to peer-to-peer anywhere in the globe. This is a big progress. If I look at my youth, this was not possible, and so you had some instruction coming from the top, in a very top-down system, which art you can do, which is not authorized, where stop the freedom of creation, etc., etc. This internet explosion has broken these rules, and I find it extremely interesting and extremely dangerous at the same time. But I am not against internet. I think it's not the same. It's a tool. It's not the same issue. Internet cannot solve the environmental problem. Plus, I know very well how much a huge internet redispatching center is using in terms of energy. So this is also to put in the balance. So when you use your smartphone, you consume a lot of energy. When you go to internet, you consume a lot of energy as well. So this is why you need a multilateral and transversal and supranational approach to these problems. This is absolutely urgent. This is, for me, where is the emergency? This supranational dialogue and inter-society dialogue. And if we don't start it now, it's going to be really problematic, because the world will be divided in two very divided parts, as it is coming now everywhere. And it's also working with the rich becoming richer, the poor becoming poorer. It's the same division. There are some who are allowed to travel, some not. There are some who are allowed to open their mouth and say things, some not. This is a global problem.
There is a think tank in Washington D.C. that I recently read about, that they map global income and how people use their income. And long story short, the conclusion from this is, of course, now I forgot the name of the think tank, but later, is to date, only 10% of the world has traveled. But 10% of the world is like 760 million, so that's still a lot of people. And I guess the issue is not about adding more to the 10%, because then, of course, if 50% of the world travels, but who is this 10%? And in our very own little way in our world, and this is for TT, the next question, as funders or supporters of mobility, inevitably, because of a lot of things, limited resources, and so on, we inevitably decide who travels and who does not travel in our own contexts. And so in supporting the mobility of cultural professionals and artists, what are your thoughts on supporting or selecting those who are, let's say, more worth it or more like bang for the buck, because you can't fund everyone? And what impact of mobility is, because mobility is a means, what impact or what outputs do you expect from those we support to travel?
Okay, before answering that provocative, it's very provocative. I mean, basically we're talking about how we consider grant applications and etc. But before that, I think just to add on to what Ferdinand has been saying is that I think your question to him about what should funders' responsibility be. And I think that for all of us working in mobility funding especially, what we can be conscious about is to actually, number one, create awareness. I mean, it could be communicated to our grantees. Mobility First can actually adopt a particular green approach or greener approach to travel through, for example, sharing information like what Melissa shared about carbon offsetting and etc. etc. So I think that it's not to reduce travel, but to make aware the issues surrounding mobility. And then this goes back to, because humans are social animals, right? So the thing is that And what it means is that we are more likely to take certain action if we see other people taking action. So there is that multiplier effect that we have been talking about in various ways. So I think that, let's say, as an individual, for example, telling my mother, please use less plastic bags, please. She's in her 80s, and it's really, really a big educational thing. But it can happen. So there is that multiplier effect. And I think that that's one approach that a funding organization, a funding body or program can adopt, just by making things more transparent, just making things more aware. We surface up the issues, we surface up the possible solutions, and like we were having a conversation with Melissa earlier on, is how do we close that gap, yeah? And to answer that very difficult question, I think that when in Mobility First in the last 3-4 years, when we've been looking at applications, personally for me, the environmental climate issue is not the first thing that comes to my head. The first thing that comes to my head really is looking at the potential of the project. And what do I mean by the potential? The potential is the expressed desire, the expressed objective of the application, and then looking at whether the methodologies that they propose to employ would actually achieve that potential. There is no guarantee that whoever we support or fund will automatically give you an A+ outcome. It is really a gamble. It is really a gamble, that we take. And the unfortunate thing is that we're not able to know every single applicant and their would-be collaborators to get a better sense of whether this particular project would fly or not. But personally, I believe that, of course, there's some projects which you could easily identify as something which may not fly very well, or there are certain projects which are well written, the applications are very well written, and we do know that there are many professional grant writers out there. And the sad part about it is that there's never enough resources for every single application that we get. So then there is that difficult choice of which one makes the list and which one doesn't. And I think in the last few days, all of us in the ASEF Mobility First group, we were talking about how more to help us assess better, and what do we hope these applications or our grantees would be able to deliver on in terms of impact, resonance, etc., etc. We had that big conversation.
And also about supporting the mobility of people that are not just for a one-off trip, where there is a higher potential for multiplier effect, both when they reach the destination and when they come back to their homes, right?
I think that the important thing is that in such cases that what we're dealing with, let's say, when we're not talking about production grants, where we are talking about the engagement of the other, the creating the dialogue, there is a very conscious, at least I think for us at the table, we're very conscious about the fact that what's in it for everybody in the mix, right? I complained when we were doing this year's application. It's like, oh my God, there's so many applications as well. Me, and myself. It's completely, in a way, understandable, but also completely, I can't comprehend. It's it's that here we are, it's a mobility grant about engaging and about understanding the other. How can, therefore, the application be only about I, me, and myself? What is it that I'm going to bring to my would-be partner? But more important, as well as importantly, what would I bring back to my ecosystem or my community, however you will define your community? And I think that what Ferdinand has been talking about is very important about this hyper-connectivity, about the self. I think that one of the work that I hope to do is to break that self, to stop having a sense that, I am entitled. Of course we're entitled, we pay tax, blah, blah, blah. But seriously, can we all function as solos or as silos without having to engage the other? Can we make artwork which is art for art's sake, only for you, and that has no relevance or resonance for anybody else? Fine, if that's okay, if you want to do it, but frankly, it will get nowhere. You are not able to talk about your work. You are not able to create a kind of a rethinking or address any kind of issues, right? And I think that recently I read, which is something very interesting, was that this is from the visual arts, primarily from the visual arts sector. It was a book. And it talked about the whole history of how conceptual art came about, with Duchamp and the toilet work and etc. etc. So it was very interesting that I've never thought of it that way, which was that I'm so used to working in theatre. It's like, oh, is it a good performance? Is it a bad performance? So you become the judge of whether it's a good or bad work. But what the book proposes was that whether the work is good or not, history and time will tell. But what is important as an audience at that particular moment when you're confronted with the work is whether or not it is an interesting idea. So let's go behind the manifestation of the object, but actually look at what propelled the artist to make that particular object and how it manifests itself, have a better kind of an understanding about it, and then draw your conclusions, as opposed to saying, oh, I don't like the performance because it's too in your face. But maybe the choice of a performance that's in your face is a choice by the director for us to be able to confront the issues, whatever issues they're talking about. So I think that, I think it's very necessary to think beyond ourselves. And I think all of us are what saying, this, like what Melissa is saying, what Ferdinand is saying, is that this whole climate change thing is much larger than us as individuals. But it doesn't stop individuals to effect change if we all come together. So if we're talking about governance, we're talking about global governance, we can begin by our votes. We need to vote, right? And to indicate through our votes, because that is still, and I hope that is still our right to reflect that it's our choice. We have a choice to not dictate, but a choice to influence how governance can be transformative. Yeah? And I think that the larger concerns, and I refuse to believe that just because I'm an individual or individuals cannot effect change. Individuals can effect change if we all band together and we just nudge each other in a particular way. That means how we put our tribes together, how we build our communities together. And different tribes, different people work separately, which is fine, and that's why there's a need for diversity, and that's why there's a need for engagement, so that we can come as a kind of holistic whole.
Yep. When we started the conversation earlier, we asked ourselves why it is that we travel in the first place, and we started with the importance of face-to-face encounters and meeting in person. But throughout the course of the discussion, actually, we are going towards the direction of the value of travel and exploration, and what art can bring to society. And all our speakers have shared their thoughts based on their professional experiences and so on. But now we just turn to like a more human side of things, and just like as TT, as Melissa, and as Ferdinand. And the question is for both TT and Melissa, our Singaporeans, and from different generations. What? It's true. Young and younger, young and younger. How would you describe your own mindset towards travel, both for professional and personal reasons? And how would you describe the same mindset also of Singapore society? Like, for example, from a non-Singaporean perspective, exploration or travel exposes people to a different world. Oftentimes, let's say a better world or a more developed world, or it also exposes you to thoughts and opinions that are very different than yours. But Singapore is like, it's already good. It's a first world country. Is there a need to look out, or not? Yeah.
Okay, so it's a great question. So I will relate this story and then I will bring it back to the conversation. But the idea is that I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if I had not gone on exchange. Okay, so I went to the National University of Singapore in my undergraduate days. I studied geography, makes sense, right? And then I had the opportunity to go to London, to King's College, to do an exchange program for 6 months. This was pre-economic, crisis, 2008. And when I came home, my dad actually told me, you're like a changed person. Like, because I had to lock up after myself, I have to cook and clean and everything. Because, I grew up with a domestic helper and never did all these things. And that really changed my life. And so I honestly tell you, I would not be here today if I hadn't had the opportunity to make that trip. And since then, I've been, again, through work, climate change research takes me all over the place. My first Conference of the Parties, I mentioned Chile earlier, the COP this year is in Chile. My first COP, Conference of Parties, 10 years ago, was in Copenhagen. And so, in a way, I've come full circle. And you asked the question about, is there any generational issues? I can't speak on behalf of TT, but I can tell you that when I was growing up, travel was always like, wow, a big thing, even for Singaporeans. Everybody wanted to go to the US, to Europe. But I think these days, many young people are thinking, you know what, I think I want to see the region first. It's a bit like a millennial thing now. Like I'd rather travel to the region and not go to these big places. There will be a chance later. But then again, there are others who do it for the gram, right? And then they go to all these wonderful, amazing places. Like they go to, I've seen pictures of people who go to Finland, Helsinki, and they go and see the waterfalls, or they go to Africa, to Latin America. It's amazing. And I think, again, it's because affluence, Singaporeans are fairly affluent, which brings me to another point. Under the UN, we actually count as a developing country, which is another thing altogether when it comes to climate change accounting. Yes. So Singapore is counted as a developing country under the UN. If you ask me why this is the case, the answer will always be that all countries are sovereign to decide. And a lot of the climate change commitments were determined by GDP in between the 1992 and 1997 timeframe when the Kyoto Protocol was inked. So that was when the bifurcation between developed and developing came about. The Paris Agreement has somewhat blurred the lines between the two sets of countries, so to speak, but that does not, it has not meant that countries like Singapore, who in 1997 was not developed, has had the chance to sort of say, I'm rich now, I'm going to commit more. Okay, but then it's all, for all of you, as TT said, go out there, get the information and vote in an informed way. You would have seen our Prime Minister is actually in New York at the moment. He actually spoke about climate change twice already, following his National Day rally speech. So I think he's doing something. You may have also heard young people, so in my generation, organize a climate rally for the first time. Okay, I see nodding, great. So for the first time in Singapore, about almost 2,000 young people went to a climate change rally in Hong Lim Park. And Hong Lim Park, oh my goodness. My parents, when I told them I was leaving the house to go Hong Lim Park, they were like, why? Isn't that the pink dot thing? I was like, sorry, pink dot is always like June, July, okay? And then they were like, but why are you going there later? You get arrested. I said, but they got their license and everything. It was fine. It was a fun afternoon. But there were issues, right? There are people who are worried about this form of activism. And I wanted to bring up something when Ferdinand was talking about civil society, ground-up action. And this is exactly it. The people in my generation are taking to the streets, not really the streets, to the Hong Lim Park in Singapore. That's the only place you can go to protest in Singapore, under license as well and under surveillance. But the point really is there's a new form of engagement with the government. In my line of work, I engage through research and convening of such meetings to be able to share information. But I think there's another group of young people, probably about 5 to 10 years younger than me. I'm 32, and so people in their 20s are starting to think of, they're inspired by Greta, right? They're inspired. And they feel that the governments have let them down. People have let them down, and they're striking for the environment. Don't know how useful that is. They should be going to school, obviously, so that they can get the education they need to get things moving, because they're going to have to find the solutions, obviously, because our generation hasn't found the solutions. So I think we are all, if I will speak for myself, we're all still grappling with this situation that we're in. The IPCC keeps on putting out worse and worse reports. I listen to 924 because I need to de-stress at the end of the day. So there's this term called eco-anxiety. Have you guys heard of eco-anxiety? Yes. So sometimes I also feel art is so important to be able to help people de-stress, because the internet, hyperconnectivity, has led us to believe that things, we get bombarded with information, online. And I mean, all of us are connected. And so I think there's this never-ending cycle of like, okay, things are getting worse, right? The IPCC never puts out information that says that, oh, we have time, it's fine. Right? They always say we have 12, 11, and then recently there's a new land report, there's a new sea report, and an ice report, right? So I'll just, the cryosphere and all that, right? So things are not getting any less urgent. And young people, I think, being so connected, are at that front because we're online all the time. So how do we deal with it? And I hope maybe this conversation can also take us to the point where maybe creation of art and collaboration can help us all to settle a little bit more and to figure out ways to solve climate change together, obviously, but also that importance of being able to take our minds off how bad the earth, bad situation we are in. So, long way to answer a short question.
I suppose I'm like-minded with Melissa, right? That means that I personally have benefited a lot from travel, and even in the last year and a half, where I have more opportunity to travel by not having a full-time job, has been very, very, very inspiring still. I think I'm one of the more fortunate ones that gets to go to quite a lot of places because of work and other reasons. But I always find that travel is inspiring. And I think that it can only be inspiring if you have an open mind. Look, I mean, Singaporeans are the most well-traveled. But how many of you, I'm sure, if you've encountered in a hotel lobby in Bangkok, and then there you have the Singaporeans coming up complaining about how awful the food is. Singaporean food is much better, right? Than, let's say, Thai food or wherever they are. So no point physically traveling if you so decide to have a close-mindedness. So I think that travel per se itself, the action of traveling and the action of mobility doesn't really amount to much for personal development, but actually it is only with the open-mindedness and the will that largesse, right, to actually welcome an alternative. I think that's more important, and that is something which reminded me about, today's Unplugged, you have this thing about Twain. So Mark Twain had said this in the 1800s. Can you imagine? Travel is fatal to... okay, I need my glasses. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And many of our people need it, surely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. Says it all. Which for me applies regardless of whatever generation we're at. And the idea that the world is becoming so much smaller also means that, we should not encourage insularity. And I'm just amazed that actually many of us are living in this island, and we hear things such as, okay, we shouldn't welcome non-Singaporeans onto our shores, where we forget where we came from. The success of Singapore has often been because of our porosity. The fact that we are free port, the fact that we have allowed the ins and the outs. So where do we get this concept that we should begin to shut down our borders? Where do we begin to get this idea that if we remain unto ourselves, we'll be fine? And this is not a kind of criticism or anything, but it's really about what has been happening for us in terms of mindset. Perhaps we are all encouraged to be more confident, which is good, but confidence should not equate ignorance or arrogance, really. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Ferdinand, same question, but more responsibility on your shoulders. So,
Wow.
what is your own mindset towards exploration and travel, but not just, let's say, in the context of your home country, France, but in a European context, especially when we relate it now to current events like the refugee crisis and Brexit and closing down of borders and malls and all these things. So yeah.
Well, first of all, it is said, and I do believe it, that one of the most successful European Union program was this Erasmus program, which has been run in the past almost 30 years, and which is a program for university students, academics, exchange. And the interesting thing is that this program has probably created the best ground floor possible for cultural development. Why? Because from these students' exchanges, first of all, there were a lot of international marriage, so it has created a lot, which is quite interesting, and my family is a part of that game. But also because these people, after 1 year studying in another country, not only they learn the language, but also they understand and touch all these cultural difference. And then when they go back home, they are the ambassadors of this cultural diversity because they have touched it. It's not only just a piece of paper with declarations, etc. They have been completely involved in this different culture. And so it's extremely important. So actually, Erasmus is not a cultural program, but it had, and it still have, a lot of cultural diversity impact, which I like very much. The question of immigration is, first of all, let's look at the number. It doesn't concern a huge population. Okay, in France today, the National Front is making big noise about Macron giving the right to, I don't know, 185 persons coming from the south to get in France. We are 70 million people. Okay, and if you see also what is happening in Germany, for example, it's big and not big at the same time. Plus, the fact that our working forces, because our original population is getting older and older, and all the economists will tell you that if we don't find a means to bring in Europe newcomers, fresh blood, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, our economy is going to be very bad. The numbers are huge. It's like we need, I don't know exactly, I'm not an economist, but it's like we need 8 million working force coming in Europe to keep our economy going on. So all this discourse is about immigration is kind of strange, and also it is carried by this nationalistic, not to say ultra-nationalistic people, on purpose. In fact, in their own forces, when you say, but isn't your friend someone from an Algerian origin? He would tell you, no, but this is not the same, this is my friend, right? But the other ones, we don't want them, blah, 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 blah. There is an instrumentalization of this thing, which I find very nasty, because it's not really against the immigration per se, but it's just because it is served for them, it serves them for other political discussions and purpose, and also to take power. I think populism and ultra-nationalism is the worst thing, not only for environment, but for many reasons. But again, what I find extremely disastrous in Europe is that these people are now breaking the society in two parts, even in very famous social democrats countries, like the North countries, like Sweden, for example, or Denmark. You have seen the very fast rising of extreme right people who are now in the government, which 20 years ago or even 15 years ago would have been completely unimaginable. And now it's there. And so the question again is how to fight these ideas, and I think one of the answers is to move people, and not to move in the way, because there is this question we have not talked about, which is for me very important. Most of the people who travel by plane today are the mass tourism industry. It's not working people. The artists who travel by plane represent a minuscule number. The big numbers are tourists taking the cheap airlines to go to someplace. So you can question the mobility of artists and cultural activists as soon as you can prove that yourself you have not used an airlines to go on holiday, but a bicycle. Because if you know, it's a problem. So do we go on holiday very far? And even by boat, in my own city, Marseille, we have a huge question about these enormous cruising ships that are coming in the harbor with 3,500 people and who are polluting machines at all levels. So who is going in, are these people using these big ships, this cruise ship, aware of what they are doing with their carbon footprint when they take it? I'm not sure. There is a different way of discussing about this, and I think we need to put everything on the table and start from scratch and make it a global issue. And even in Europe, this question of environment is not answered the same way from these different countries. The problem of Europe, which is its quality and its problem at the same time, is it is not one government with one administration. It's 27 governments, and in the European administration, they send their civil servants, so you have all the nationalities. They are supposed to be independent from their country once they are in the European administration, but of course they receive orders, and obviously not orders, but they are influenced by their governments to push in directions. So this is a political issue, because if you have 5, 6, 10, 12 extreme right government in Europe, it will change the whole behavior of Europe, because we are in a democratic organization, and so they can push in a way. And another number which is also very frightening for me is that the difference between rich and poor regions in Europe, not countries, is the range is 1 to 18. 1 to 18. So you have regions in Romania, for example, you can say they are 18 times less rich than the richest regions in Europe. So how do you organize political dialogue in this situation? It's quite complicated. And yes, I mean, this is also why Europe is interesting, because this is a laboratory of this supranational governance. It's not working very well, but I don't see any other way to try to go beyond this manipulation from nationalist interests.
Thank you very much, Ferdinand. And I think on that note, I think we have been a very attentive audience. No need for me to summarize anything. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A, where you can please ask questions. Please don't be shy. And yeah, the floor is open. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for all the input and so much to digest. I just want to pick up on Titi's point about the artist being one who reaches out and communicate with the public, especially on issues which I think are very, very pertinent and very important in society. I think lately I attended an art exhibition in the National Gallery where a very prominent Chinese artist did this video production as well as a sculpture, I think, of a rhinoceros. And he talks about poaching and how, what a terrible thing it is. And I was very moved and I was so encouraged that it came from a Chinese, because, you know, a lot of the poaching, the rhino horns and all that actually go into the market in China because of their belief in TCM and all that. So I think artists can actually play a very crucial role in terms of raising environmental issues as well as sustainability issues. So I'm just wondering, like, could you perhaps comment a bit more in this area? Because I really would like to know about artists that perhaps have ventured into this area of raising environmental awareness. Thank you.
And well, I can't claim to know it all, but just kind of like a kind of a view. If we're talking about Singapore per se, I think there's very little, or maybe not enough artwork or artists working on surfacing environmental and climate issues, quite frankly. There are attempts at it, but the larger question is, I think the artwork that perhaps you are talking about could be by Lowe, I think. Yeah? And Lowe, interestingly, made that work in the 80s. And as we can see, it's still very, very relevant. But there's not many, I think, I mean, there are many artists here today, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that there's many of us who actually pick to choose in that particular area and discussion. More can be done. But also the question is that, is there a way for the arts and the artists to work across sector, right? So for example, would an artist begin to have a conversation with someone like Melissa and to actually have a better understanding of this issue, and therefore perhaps could then better express or surface up certain things through artistic works? Yeah. I wish there was more. I wish there was more. But quite frankly, but I don't think that we see a lot of that, at least in Singapore. Yeah, maybe in Europe it's like different.
Ferdinand will.
Just that the anecdote about the birth of music, the guy who wrote it, Jack Attali, also says that historically speaking, art is the reflection of society. So if in a country there is not so much art talking about environmental issue, it's because the society where he is or she is doesn't touch so much the question. The day this question raised in his or her country, then art will talk about it. So art is just a mirror. It's a mirror, but it's the mirror of what is unsaid and invisible, as I said before. This is also why people love some artists, because these artists, through their work, touch the things they cannot express themselves. So it touches them very deeply. So they express, the artists express it in their name. So the artists, the art express what is in the society, including what is invisible in the society, but what is, mushrooming and growing. And so you cannot blame an art sector or an art scene not to pick up on this and this issue, because they just reflect the society where they are.
I just remembered that, how many of you know who Inch Chua is? Inch? Did you all go and see her show about the Antarctica? I can't remember what's it called now, but like she went to the Antarctica. Yeah, it was so wonderful. Yeah, she went to Antarctica on a sort of a mission with Sir Robert Swan, who is a sort of polar explorer, and she came back to Singapore and she did this wonderful work where she had recorded sounds from Antarctica, and she was very I guess she was very upset with the destruction. She saw the ice melting in front of her eyes, and she wanted to bring that back to audiences in Singapore. And I think when we have champions like that in the art landscape in Singapore, we're starting to see, I think the good thing is that we're starting to see artists, mainstream artists, as well as I think some budding. I have a friend here, Cheryl, who's doing some artwork on environment. So we're starting to see art moving in that direction, which is a good thing. But I agree with both of you. Very interesting discussion so far.
Hi. So I think Ferdinand has talked a lot about the importance of talking to global governance and supranational governance, and I think that applies to Singapore as well, because I think a lot of us here think Singapore is such a small country, we don't matter. But actually we do matter in a lot of ways, like using whatever degree of soft power we have to talk to neighboring countries, or the fact that we are such a key role in the refinement of oil and gas, a huge role that we play. So I think that Singapore actually does matter, and we should be concerned about climate. I guess my question is nominally for Melissa, which is, what do you think about the future of the Singapore climate rally and the new climate movement that's come about? Because I think, for me, I'm happy for it. I'm happy that it exists, but I'm kind of worried about it as well, because I think activist is such a dirty word in Singapore. It's so difficult. Like the rally got approved for Hong Lim Park, but then just as easily could have been denied, and the authorities wouldn't even have needed to give an explanation. And actually, at this point, I think there's so many parallels between the lives of activists and artists as well. Because if you're an art professional, I'm sure you know, like, you can just get cancelled for no reason whatsoever. And in that sense, the authorities are very diva, I guess. Like, I went to a performance art piece a few weeks ago, and it was about being queer and trans and Malay and Muslim. So a little bit sensitive, obviously. a little bit sensitive. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, MDA only gave an age restriction of 18 up the day before as well. So that's kind of an example of how the authorities kind of subtly control discourse and art and activism. So that made me, so first of all, that makes me worry about the Singapore climate movement, and secondly, that makes me think that it will be so fruitful if artists and activists here talk to each other more. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. That was wonderful. So how many of you actually read PM Lee's speech at the UN? He just delivered it yesterday, so maybe not yet. Anybody? Raise your hands. Okay, he actually talked about two things: multilateralism and climate change. Okay, and the reason why, I mean, multilateralism obviously is in direct response to the rise of populism and nationalism, which Ferdinand has shared. So I don't need to go into that. But the climate change part, he actually acknowledged the SG climate rally. Of course, he acknowledged it in the context of the global climate strike, right? So Greta's movement around the world. So he acknowledged that. And I agree with you completely when you say, so it's a mix of excitement but also fear. And I think sort of that's how it kind of is in Singapore. Both artists and environmentalists sort of tread a very fine line between, what is advocacy and activism. When you talk about climate change in Singapore, it's inevitable that you end up talking about the energy sector and the petrochemical sector. And I think many of you I see nodding, which means that you probably know Singapore is home to one of the largest, probably a top 5 largest petrochemical hubs in the world that sits on Jurong Island. And they're probably not going anywhere. And one of the reasons for this is that when you invest heavily in a country, you don't just make decisions like that, I'm leaving. All right, so perhaps when the government says, oh, we cannot tax them so high because they will leave, they're not going anywhere, okay? Shell has been here since 1961. Okay, Pulau Bukom. I can see it from my office every day. And then ExxonMobil runs its largest refinery operations out of Singapore. It makes sense for them to go green, to become efficient, because it means a better bottom line for them, right? But the thing is, it's seemingly incongruent with our climate goals, which, if you go and look it up, in itself may not be that ambitious to begin with, lah. Okay, that has links to it, the fact that we are labelled as a developing country, and so a lot of we're sort of given a bit of lax rules to play around with. If any of you are interested, I can take this offline. Okay, this is recorded. But I think it speaks to a point where I think some of us are afraid to talk about these things also in public, because it means that do we not love Singapore enough to see it survive economically as a country? Because without the economy, actually a lot of things will not be in Singapore. A lot of other companies will not be in Singapore. But that also can be applied to climate change. If we don't do anything, actually Singapore will probably not matter and that's the narrative you hear, right? So if Singapore were to shut down completely tomorrow, all our industries, our electricity generation, we only account for 0.1% of global emissions. Then the argument that the SG Climate Rally folks brought up, which is rightly so, the fact that we are home to that large petrochemical facility means that our impact, our culpability is actually larger than us in Singapore, larger than 0.1% of global emissions. And not to mention that shipping emissions, so we are the top bunker port in the world, which means there's the largest number of ships coming here to refuel because of our strategic location. That emissions alone from bunker fuels is 2.6 times of our land-based emissions. And that's not counted to our inventory, because of how the world sort of segregates the sectors. So if you ask me, I think the future of the rally is if they can turn words into action, I think that would be a lot more impactful. Rallying can only do so much, and the media will then paint you in a certain light. I know some of the folks behind the SG Climate Rally, and I think they've really got the heart to go out there and speak to stakeholders to try and get things moving. But it's an insurmountable challenge. I think it's the challenge of our time, to really address climate change. And as PM said during the National Day rally, I'm sorry to keep coming back to PM, but he used 20 minutes of his National Day rally time, air time, to talk about climate change, but he didn't talk about mitigation. Okay, so he talked about what? He talked about adaptation, which means we're screwed anyway, guys. Whatever we do on Singapore, it's not going to matter because sea levels are going to rise, temperatures are going to change, and we will feel it worse because we're an island that is completely urbanized, so urban heat island effect. So we've got to figure out ways to survive. It's an existential issue for us. If we do not raise our coastal areas by perhaps 5 meters even, there's a real chance that by the end of the century, Singapore will not even exist or will be half the size, unless you live on Bukit Timah or something like that, all right? So, but everybody else, so Rangoon is under the sea level actually, so quite worrying. But really the point is, I think this all points to the fact that even if we were to do as much as we could, and I think Singapore is constrained in its own way, let's not beat around the bush, we have constraints in harnessing renewable energy, right? Where are we going to put solar panels? On roofs, yes, but then we have rain half the year, cloud cover most of the time. So there are real geographical constraints to harnessing renewables. Somebody just sent me an article about Australia making an undersea cable to give us solar power. I don't know lah. Yeah, Australia is so far away. I mean, you might as well take it from Laos, like their hydropower is nearer, right? It's a lot closer actually. So, I mean, all things considered, I think solving climate change from Singapore is highly complex because of our competing interests with economic growth and so on and so forth. But I think really if you have concerns about the climate rally's future, I share those concerns. But I think it's a new form of engagement that I find that our government is also starting to figure out their own way to engage. And the fact that PM mentioned it at the UN, his first ever UN speech, he mentioned youth, the energy of the youth. I think that's something to celebrate, I suppose. Yeah, I know I say that with a little bit of skepticism.
The other question was also about arts activism and content management, right? AKA censorship. Now, so in the work that we do, in the theatre, in the arts and all that, we always are confronted with this whole idea of what they call content management and or censorship. And oftentimes, the reason given to us, as in the artists making work, is that, well, society is not ready for it. And it's very interesting that you talked about how whatever you were watching, or was it a Malay, transgender person, it was very interesting that you used to say it's a little bit sensitive. So if we think about that, if we reflect about that, is that what needs to happen is that people like yourself, audiences like yourself, need to have a mindset change. What is sensitive about a transgender Malay person? 1. 2, if we agree that it's not sensitive to be a Malay transgender person, and being on stage talking about it, please reflect it to the authorities so that they do not use that lame excuse to say society is not ready for it, our Singapore audiences are not ready for it, and therefore we need to impose an RA18 or RA20 on a performance. Because many times when you go to these performances, it is really not all that sensitive or affronting. But if we are affronted by it, then let's process that a little bit and have a conversation with the artists. And I do believe that Singapore artists and artists around the world are more than happy to have a conversation. So what we need right now, as in what Melissa has pointed out about the rally, and how does rally, then activism, then actually become action. Similarly, in the arts, we need the audience and the community that is supporting the artists to do the same, to signal to the few who are making the decisions to say, it is fine. Society is ready for it, whatever it is. And I think that's what our problem has been all this while, because we are not verbalizing the fact that we are ready, we are adult and we're grown up enough to have a conversation of diversity. So I urge all of us who are not necessarily in the arts but enjoy the arts, please signal this. It is fine, we're ready, we're grown-ups. We're about 50, whatever. So we should be ready, yeah, we're grown-ups. Yeah.
most of the animators of the so-called Arab Spring in the Arab countries were artists. They pay very much for that now, because, and especially young artists, because they were leading the thing. It's just to say, as I said before, you cannot defend biodiversity if you do not defend cultural diversity and political pluralism. I am very happy to go as an artist to fight publicly with my friends and the civil society to defend the biodiversity. I expect from the international environmental organizations and environmental militants to do the same to protect cultural diversity, which is not always the case, because they should understand this is the same question, this is the same problem. So again, this, if you look, for example, you're talking about huge, heavy oil industries. If you look, for example, at Providence Equity Fund, which is one of the biggest investment fund in the US, they claim this year on their website, you can go, Providence Equity Fund, to invest $50 billion in the culture, okay? As a matter of comparison, the French Ministry of Culture, which is supposed to be one of the richest in Europe, has barely given 1 billion euros budget last year, 2018, which is like 50 times less. So these are the global players. They have global strategy. They are above. They are also supranational. So if we want to contain these guys and to match the interest of these guys, we have to be supranational also and transversal, holistic. I don't think there will be any success, any implementation of the Earth, of the global society, if we just target one thing and not the other one. Okay, we can target one thing, but we must be fully aware of the transversal links with the rest of the problematic. So I urge the environmental organizations, which are very often told as a model for the cultural organization, to look also on their side that this question of cultural diversity is very much at stake and should be very much defended as well as the rest. It's very important.
Thank you very much to the panel for a very interesting discourse. I have a comment and then a question, possibly for Melissa and possibly also for Titong as well. I was at a gathering of an international group of indigenous communities in London a couple of weeks ago, and what struck me about that, as compared to the rallies all around the world, including the one in Singapore, is how little they focus on the doom and gloom. What they did instead was actually focus on what a miracle the world is. And this is apart from the fact that they are on the front lines of actually fighting all sorts of things, deforestation, racism, prejudice, all kinds of things, that people have been murdered and raped and all that sort of stuff, more so than any of us in Singapore can even imagine. Yet, what they talked about was, it is your inner climate that is more important than what's happening outside. And with this eco-anxiety that is happening in young people as young as 10, which I've read about, I'm concerned, how are these people going to then develop a sense of self and resilience to combat what will become even more urgent? And so my question to Melissa is something about the language that we're using, especially when you mentioned about how the IPCC reports are getting worse every year. Is it really useful to continue to use this scenario, even though we know it's there, science is clear, to keep on harping about that and make people become really fearful of the future rather than hopeful, which is the message I got from indigenous communities from 170 communities all around the world. So is there something that we can do differently now And is there something the arts as well can do to make this more empowering rather than disempowering, which is the language I see at the rally, which is why I stay away from it. Because I think the words that we use are things and they're really, really super powerful. Thank you.
That was helpful. Thank you so much for giving the context for the question. I mean, I was at the rally, I thought it was empowering. As a person who's been in this for 10 years, first time, you know, I thought it was empowering because they asked me to speak and I turned it down because I was too afraid to go up on stage. And you've seen the footage of people who did go up and they did give very, you know, convincing speeches, and I just didn't think I would be able to do that, given that I do research and my money comes from the government and it's very hard for me to do it. Again, self-censorship, right? Okay. I agree with you. I think the language that's being used is probably doing more harm than good. And eco-anxiety obviously is being caused by the bombardment of information. I've recently been talking to folks in the media industry who are covering climate change. And a lot of work is currently being done to cover it accurately. So I think more of the campaigns are out there to convey the sense of urgency. And so that's why that language is being used, because the media, the governments feel that not enough is being done. But I take your point. I feel that perhaps the language of hope may be more appropriate for particular age groups, for instance. So in the schools, certainly, or we could even start to bring in maybe people in the mental health sector to start looking at these problems that we're basically creating. Let me just point out one thing in Singapore. There was a professor in Yale NUS that did a study last year about the impact of climate change, its messaging, and birth rates. So this is something that's going to scare the Singapore government a lot, because there are many young people who feel that they're no longer interested in having children, who are going to inherit a planet that is on its way to self-destruction anyway. And hello, the Singapore government keeps telling people to have kids, right? So the total fertility rate is like 1.2 right now. And I think maybe we could start looking at it from a public health point of view, maybe from the population point of view, to start not saying bad things about the environment. But the problem is not going to go away, essentially. And I think as more of our media professionals get more savvy with the language of science, unfortunately, they're just going to get more, they're interested in getting the accuracy rather than anything else. But maybe I'll talk to them about getting the message of hope out. Interestingly enough, at Straits Times, the person who covered the rally also, has recently changed his title from assistant foreign editor to become climate change editor. So you can also see the importance that media platforms are attaching to climate change. And that's I think it's just going to get more important over time. But whether or not we debate the science is separate. This year will be the final year for the Paris Agreement. We call it the rule book, so how to operationalize the Paris Agreement. The final part of it is supposed to be agreed this year. So next year onward, there's no reason to go to these meetings, as far as I'm told. Rather, people should start to implement the changes, renewables, stuff like that. All right, carbon markets is the final thing, essentially. But again, I take your point. It's very important for us to start thinking about communication. While I have the mic, maybe I'll also point to the fact of the composition of people at the rally. Many of us, myself included, are upper middle income people. Environment, I was sharing with TT just before all of you came in, that environment is actually one of the most polarizing issues in any society. In Singapore, we don't feel it so much, but it is, right? So if you do a survey, you'll probably find that a lot of people feel it's not necessary to address climate change, because when there's inequality, when there's systemic inequality, people are finding it hard to put food on the table, make ends meet. Why should we even be talking about climate change? And so it's also reflected in the demographic of those who attended the rally, right? It's because we have free time on Saturday, we're not working, and we go down, we have some fun, right? But I think the reality is certainly true for indigenous people who are at the front of the effects of climate change. So we need to remember that, we need to recognize that. I think in a country like Singapore, an affluent country, we have that luxury of talking, sitting in a nice room today, talking about climate change, but not many people do elsewhere in the region and further far. So thank you for that. It was enlightening, I think, for me and also for many people in this room.
Okay, I can do this two ways. One is I can be politically correct, and the other way is that I just be true to myself. I'm going to choose the option of the latter. I'm sorry, darlings. This is the harsh realities of the world. And I understand about eco-anxiety, but there's hundreds of other ways that we can be completely anxious in modern day living. And this is just one more. And if we look at the most recent 25th of September, the UN report, IPCC report, this is the first time, okay, this is not because I've been reading the reports, but this is through different news media and all that. The report has used much stronger language, like devastating, and words which are very strong, and I suppose there is a reason for it, because of the urgency of the matter on hand. And I think that for any young person, we shouldn't be modeling coddling by the fact that, things will get better. Yes, things will get better if everybody does something about it. It's not going to get better if this particular young person is going to sit in his or her room and angst about it, right? And quite frankly, I'm sure there are a lot of people who do not agree with Greta Thunberg's message. She's been attacked right now, including by our wonderful blogger, Xiao Xue, right? Who basically say, what does this 16-year-old know? She's crying, blah, blah, blah. But the fact is that we may or may not agree with her language, but she has brought a spotlight onto the issue. She has taken a very proactive way of bringing the spotlight of this issue, rightly or wrongly. She's very accusatory that you're robbing me of my childhood to a lot of governments, but it is not necessarily a negative thing. It's harsh, it's harmful. But life has taught me that's my own personal mantra, that we go through the difficult times, and out of these difficult times, there is hope. But hope can only come about if we decide to make a change of these difficult times, if we do something about it. No one owes us a living. There's no sense of entitlement here. If we want a better world, we just collectively work at it. And that's how I see it. And like what Ferdinand says is that the artists are the best mirrors of what is happening in society. Yes, the arts and the arts community, the artists and all of us working in the arts can bring better, more focused spotlight on the issues that's on hand. But single-handedly, we can't do it alone. Single-handedly, we need to work with people who are like Melissa, with the science. Single-handedly, we need to work with the media people. But more importantly, we need to work with the community that support the arts, who would then propagate and become our ambassadors of our message. Because rightly or wrongly, the arts, as in everywhere around the world, we only form a very minority in the larger scheme of things. And that's why in Singapore, we are the second lowest funded sector, because the priority is that low. But never mind, it's doom and gloom for the arts, but have we really given up? No, we have many of the artists here who I know we're struggling, it's very gloomy situation, hence the Arts Resource Hub and all that. We're trying to get things together about sustainability. But it doesn't stop us from being hopeful, that we hope for a better tomorrow. But let's take the hard knocks in life and deal with it. Take the bull by its horns and let's work on it. That's my take in response to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Titi. I think we have time for just one more question. One last? Yeah, sure. If there's no one else? Okay.
I just want to respond to her comment as well as all the rest. I teach research skills. I have taught over 20 disciplines. And just over this 1 week, I've taught students of workplace safety, engineering students, and sustainable tourism. So in all of those 3 disciplines, I actually talk about climate change. But I talk about it in a way where they have to think about how they're going to do research and reach solutions. So, workplace safety, they're very, very affected by the haze because these guys work in construction areas where they're out 12 hours a day in the open. And so I think what we really need to do, I'm very grateful that I'm an educationalist, that I can have an impact by inspiring young people to think about solutions. But I think what we really need to do is to get every sector in the economy to start thinking about what small changes they can make within their sector that can make a difference. And I think this is one area we have not explored yet. I'm trying to get a group started on LinkedIn where different professionals can start thinking about, their impact that they can create on sustainability. So I think Melissa is in the best place to comment on that. I hope we can have a bigger push in this area.
Yes, absolutely. I'm working with educators and primarily in MOE, trying to drive like curriculum. So I don't like to use this in front of educators, but it's the term training the trainers. So again, this is mainly for mainstream schools in Singapore, and I know that reach is only so limited. But also, in addition to your point, I think that LinkedIn group is great, but I think also education needs to begin, it's so cliche, but at home. There are a lot of kids who tell me, look, I can do all this stuff in school, but then like when I go home, it's all undone. Yeah, so, and also the best educators, the first educators of everyone is actually your parents. So parents need to take a lot of responsibility for that mindset, whether or not we are teaching our kids the right thing, eat dirty, don't go and pick up, or don't clear the tray because the auntie needs a job. Yeah, these things need to change. Yeah, I've heard that before also. Okay, so I think, as Titi said, I think it's small change that can lead to big change. And if anybody is interested to work with me on, I guess, climate change education, I'm very happy to connect. Just let me know. Yeah, very happy to just share more information anytime. Cool. I think we really need to wrap up.
Thank you very much, everyone, for spending your Saturday early evening with us. But drop off your survey form in the box there. Thank you. And we have a small reception through this door. So if you join us and walk towards here, we will open these doors, and we have like some mini bites and some drinks where we can continue the conversation with our speakers and with each other offline. Thank you very much.